Hi, everyone. My name is Ested Herndon. I am a national political reporter for the New York Times, an occasional guest host of The Daily. And today I am coming to you from an Iowa hotel room where I'm about to cover a political rally tonight, but I'm usually based out of my very small apartment in Brooklyn. Thank you for joining us for this subscriber only event. Next week, citywide celebrations kick off with the tagline, New York City is back. But with COVID cases increasing and worries about the Delta variant, which is ravaging through the country, it's not as simple as that headline. Is New York City back? And a bigger question is, do we want the city to be back? And do we want the city to be back in the same way that we knew it? In today's event, we are going to try to understand this moment for New York City and for all cities and what the future might hold. We're going to do it in three parts. The first is we're going to speak with Eric Adams, the Democratic mayoral nominee for New York City and the overwhelming favorite to be the next mayor of New York. So much of the city's recovery may depend on him. That's a crucial conversation. The second is we're going to talk to Metro columnist Genya Belafonte and architecture critic Michael Kimmelman, who will join us to take your questions. In the third part, we'll close with a wide-ranging conversation with two prominent New York City artists, Chef Marcus Samuelsson and playwright Jeremy O. Harris. They'll talk about New York City's cultural livelihood. But first, let's turn to Eric Adams, who was a bit of an underdog during the crowded Democratic primary early in the summer. I remember when I met Eric Adams earlier this year to do a profile by Easter, he wasn't the favorite at the time. Andrew Yang was. Eric Adams is the son of a Queen house cleaner who became a city police officer, a push for reform inside the New York City Police Department. Most recently, he was the first Black person elected Brooklyn Borough President. Our City Hall Bureau Chief, Emma Fitzsimmons, spoke to him earlier. Here's an excerpt of that conversation.
First of all, congrats on winning the primary. I know you still have a general election in November, but I think it's fair to say you have a good chance of winning. So congratulations.
Thank you very much. And you're right. Baseball games are 9 innings, not eight innings. And I have one more inning to go, and I'm still focused and determined for that last inning.
How did you know my first question was going to be a baseball question? So you've been celebrating your victory, and you recently threw out the first pitch at a Mets game with your son, Jordan. You'll be the first mayor in 2 decades who isn't a Red Sox fan and isn't from the Boston area. So why is it important for the city to have a lifelong New Yorker as mayor, and what will be your biggest difference with Mayor Bill de Blasio?
Attending the games. I believe that your mayor should be sitting in the stands, rooting on the home team, and just showing everyday New Yorkers how much you enjoy our home team.
And in terms of Mayor de Blasio, what's one way you'll be different from him as mayor if you win in November?
Probably how I move around the city. I just enjoy people. From the days of being a police officer, I will park my car and walk around. I'm going to be on the subway more than any other mayor. You're going to see me in a laundromat, walking through the grocery store aisles, looking at the prices of items so I can understand. I'm being an NYCHA. I'm not going to be at City Hall.
So your victory was unexpected by some on the left who believe that the events of the past year, including the murder of George Floyd and the mass protests, as well as the city's reputation for liberalism, would favor a left-leaning candidate. What do you think about your victory? What do you think that the political left missed? What did they misunderstand about the city's electorate?
I think the far left, not the progressive, because I'm a progressive. I consider myself to be so. They didn't understand the rich legacy I have in this city, going back from marching against police abuse against young Clifford Glover, who was shot during the 70s. You know, people just didn't understand how much individuals knew my relationship with Abner Louima, Amadou Diallo, Sean Bell. So many of these cases, when you talked about police reform, this is what I cut my teeth in, and it was my life work. And I think that many people just did not understand that.
My next question is about schools, and I have 2 young kids, and I know a lot of parents in New York City are anxious right now as we continue to go through this 3rd wave of the pandemic. Mayor de Blasio has been adamant that schools will reopen in person for all students next month, and that they'll stay open with no remote option. Would you have a similar approach if you take office in January?
Yes, our schools must be open. Emma, it's more than just academics. It's about emotional intelligence. What we will do to our children if we don't allow them the socialization, if we don't allow them to be in a classroom experience, it will really, it'll have a long-term impact on our young people. I believe that COVID is going to be with us for a long time, different variants, and we need to build our city around that reality. And having our babies stay home from school is just not a reality.
I'm wondering how you view your job as the city's cheerleader. Are you optimistic about the city's future? And what can you do in your first 100 days to strengthen the city's economic recovery?
Well, it's all tied together. You know, Emma, I talk about all the time when I was going through a chronic disease, losing my eyesight, having nerve damage, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. And I went to one doctor. He said, Eric, I can give you medicine for each one of your ailments, or you could deal with the underlying reasons that you are experiencing these vision loss and other issues. And I decided to do that. That's what we are as a city. Our city is dysfunctional, and we need to acknowledge that. Cities are made up of agencies. And if those agencies are taking taxpayers' dollars and producing an inferior or dysfunctional product, we're going to continue to have the problem. So what do we must do? Number one, we have to build the foundation. That's public safety. It's the prerequisite to prosperity. If we're not safe, we're not going to deal with the other pillars of our society. Second, we must ensure that our city is attracted to do business. We're losing too many people to Florida. For God forbid, why are people going to Miami is baffling me. But we need to make sure that we become a city that is easy to do business, less bureaucratic, and encourage the opening of business. A third, we have to get our offices back open. Let's start out with 2 days a week to get people back into the office space, and then let's amp it up and have our ecosystem of our financial ecosystem thrive in the way it ought to be.
Okay, now I think we have a reader question coming.
My biggest concern is the survival of small businesses and the health of our public transit systems. How are we going to get people back to the office? How are we going to get that part of our economy going again? Thank you.
Great question, Patrick. And there's several things we must do right away. Number one, the city and state, they must come out with clear guidelines on what a safe environment is for our office spaces. Something similar to the buildings that are LEED certified. Second, we need to put transit police officers back into the subway system. They need to be deployed correctly. You should not have 4 or 5 officers congregating around a token booth. As a former transit police officer, they need to be on every train, inspecting every platform, walking through the system. Third, have to get the homeless population off the subway system. They must get the mental health attention that they need.
So Mayor Bill de Blasio often says that he wants to be held accountable on 2 things, schools and the police, because those are 2 issues that he controls, unlike the subway, for instance. Do you agree that those are the 2 most important issues you'll face as mayor? I
would expand further on the areas I think are crucial. I think Department of Health and Mental Hygiene is crucial. We have to stop feeding our healthcare crisis. Second, Department of Buildings. It plays a major role in our economic stability and the growth in the city. It is one of the only agencies in the city that you need an expediter. Can you imagine that? You have to hire someone to help you navigate the Department of Building. And yes, police is crucial. I want a police commissioner that not only understands how to fight crime, but also understands how we must rebuild trust between the community and our police department.
You've talked a lot about public safety on the campaign trail, and we have this question from a reader in Midtown.
Good morning, Borough President Adams. Safety and the perception of safety in Midtown, specifically around Port Authority Bus Terminal and Penn Station, has become a dire concern over the last year. While there's little appetite to return to the draconian policing methods of the past, turning a blind eye to what's happening is not a solution. How would you address these challenges and restore confidence in the safety and comfort of our public realm?
Thank you, Barbara, for that question. And it must be done in layers. We are going to allow our team made up of mental health professionals, law enforcement officers, and those who are competent in the area of drug usage. They are going to focus on those hotspot areas, partner with those great nonprofits we have in the city, and eradicate the problem that we're facing, because crime and the lack of safety is not only actual, it's perceived.
And we have another follow-up question from a reader about crime.
What do you think about the prospect of removing NYPD from schools, as well as expanding upon mental health service responders?
You can have effective policing without abusive policing. I am not going to remove school safety officers from our schools. If you have an environment that's dangerous and you expect teachers to resolve that violence instead of educating, that is unfair. Now, we can have and decrease the number of school safety agents, but at the doors of the school where people are coming in, I want my school safety agents there. And we should also give our school safety agents better pay and better training.
The city is at a pivotal moment when it comes to the pandemic. What do you think of the idea of vaccine mandates and mask mandates? Are you concerned that your supporters in communities of color and blue-collar New Yorkers don't support those types of restrictions?
Yes, I am concerned. And there's some historical challenges that people are overcoming, and we have to be honest about that. The Tuskegee experiment is real. The distrust of many people of color they have for medical institutions around examinations, how they're treated, believing that Black and brown people have a higher level of tolerance for pain. All of these studies are real. And with that in mind, we have to be clear that this virus is also real. So there are several things we would do automatically. We'll reinstitute the census team and allow them to go on the ground, have these credible messengers carry out this important job. Number two, once FDA puts in place its final approval, right now there was an emergency approval, then we can engage in a real conversation about testing and vaccination. And I'm more inclined to move to mandate vaccination. I'll sit down with all the union reps and talk about why this is so important to do so as we move forward. We have to defeat COVID. We can't go backwards, and the city is ready to do so.
If you're elected in November, it would be historic. You would be the city's second Black mayor. And we were curious, do you feel any pressure being the second Black mayor, especially after David Dinkins did not win a second term?
I love it. My coach used to say that to me as a child, Eric, you just always want the ball when the game is on the line. Winners want the ball when the game is on the line. I love this city. I wore that bulletproof vest for 22 years and protected the children and families of the city. I know what works and what doesn't, and we can fix it. We can end inequalities. We can address our homeless issue, and we can make sure that this city continue to grow and thrive and educate our children. So, as my son would say, bring it on. I'm ready for this.
Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it, Eric.
Thank you. Take care and have a great day.
Thank you. A shout out to Emma for those questions and to Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams for his time. I am now joined by Genia Belafonte, columnist with the New York Times MetroJet, and Michael Kimmelman, the Times architecture critic. Welcome, Genia and Michael. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, happy to be here.
For our subscribers, we've read the hundreds of questions that you all have sent in advance. And if you have others, you can submit it on your question form below. But since we just heard from Eric Adams, let's start with politics. Andrew Cuomo, the current governor, has just a few days left as governor of New York after he announced that he would resign following an investigation into misconduct. Cuomo and current New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio have a notoriously unproductive relationship that has sometimes flown out into open hostility, to say the least. Subscribers Sue from Portland, Oregon, and Alexa from New York asked, what difference will it make for New York City to have Kathy Hochul, now the lieutenant governor, at the helm in Albany? Genia, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think that, she is a centrist like Cuomo, but in terms of her affect and her management style and just her style in general, it will make a huge difference. You know, the mayor and Lieutenant Governor Hochul had a meeting this week, and there was a photo op of them, you know, over a plate of cookies, and they were yucking it up like Samantha and Carrie. You know, they're having a great time. And that is a really important signal. That relationship will certainly be devoid of the petty acrimonies that impeded so many things from happening in New York. The other thing is that Lieutenant Governor Hochul is already running for governor, you know, so she's going to want to ingratiate herself with all different kinds of populations and really familiarize herself with New York City because she is an upstate politician. She's from Buffalo. Another thing we know about her is that she is unlike Governor Cuomo, who was really not interested in what people thought about him. He was just interested in his own sense of power and entitlement. She is a play ball politician. When she was the county clerk in Erie County, she went against then Governor Spitzer, who wanted to issue driver's license to undocumented immigrants. She was catering to a conservative upstate population. Later, when she had a bigger platform, she reversed. So I think she is really going to listen to people. She's already met with Jumaane Williams, city's public advocate, who was her opponent in the lieutenant governor's race a few years ago. And I think she wants to be heard. But she really wants to listen to people. And I think she really, really wants to know the city. So it'll be good.
So what you're saying is that the incentives have flipped from Cuomo to Hochul, whereas she would have a political incentive to invest in the city, to have a good working relationship with the mayor, partly because this is a base where she's unknown.
Exactly. And she's really going to, because she's running and she's going to want, you know, to raise funds. Obviously, you can only go so far raising money of the kind she needs to win in Buffalo. She's going to meet with the city's, you know, big power brokers and real estate interests and banking interests. And I think she will also, though, she knows how powerful the progressive wing of the party is. So she is going to really try, I think, to thread that needle. And you know, it's funny, the mayor said, when he was asked by reporters, how did that meeting go? He said, well, we had a very sane conversation, which is, of course, an incredibly low bar, but a meaningful one, given the history of the past, you know, 8 years.
Michael, we know the pandemic isn't over. New York City is seeing an uptick in cases through hospitalizations and deaths, but nowhere near the peaks that we saw before. We should be clear there. Some companies, including the New York Times, are not requiring workers to come to the office. You recently took a walk in Midtown Manhattan, a place I have not been in months and months and months. How does it feel there? Is it eerie or is it back?
It's somewhere in between. You know, I was there sort of the week that we shut down the city back in March 2020. And, you know, that was really eerie. I mean, the only people on the street, almost literally, you know, were the costumed Elmos and Mickey Mouses who were looking for Marks on 42nd Street. You know, now the food shops are open again. The sidewalks are pretty busy. I went to a Japanese restaurant that had a line out the door. And that was great. But as you say, the Times is closed, and so are Broadway theaters still at the moment. And, you know, Midtown is not like many other parts of the city, which are mixed use, residential. It's still overwhelmingly offices. And so it has this feeling of being kind of like somebody, you know, who wakes up kind of groggy on a cloudy morning and is trying to decide whether to, you know, pull the covers over again or get cracking. It's really not decided yet. And that's a funny, not entirely without hope, but a funny, slightly troubling vibe still.
Several subscribers, Farhana and Hermenegildo from New York, wondered if companies have stopped leasing office space, what will happen to the city's tax base? The federal government gave the city about $22 billion, and we know that pulled a lot of cities out of a deep financial hole. But what about after that? Jinya, do we have a sense of what economists or budget analysts are predicting for the financial future of New York?
Yeah, I mean, I talked to a lot of economists who are actually quite sanguine, much more than they were a year ago. One reason, of course, is that, you know, money coming in from the federal government. Another is that both for the third and fourth quarters at the state level, tax revenues were much higher than expected. Most recently, over close to $5 billion higher. So that's cause for optimism. The second thing, of course, is that we have managed, the state did, because of Cuomo's diminished authority, the state legislature was able to pass a tax increase on the wealthiest New Yorkers, which is something that Cuomo was, more powerful, had opposed and opposed and opposed. We're going to be seeing that revenue in the coming years. In the first fiscal year that that's in effect, it'll raise $2.75 billion. So those, that kind of thing is reason for hope. The other thing is, I think as we see these tax increases on the wealthiest New Yorkers, and as we see people not live in New York, which is this, this medium among business people, oh, you can't raise taxes on the rich, they're going to leave, they're going to leave. Study after study shows they don't leave. I don't think the increases are huge enough to force people to go to Florida, and I think as we see how successfully that plays out, there might be all kinds of possibly other tax increases on corporations, et cetera, that could raise even more revenue.
We also now, going back to the previous conversation with Eric Adams, there's a new administration coming in who might be a little more amenable to that upper class and wealthy rather than the de Blasio administration. You heard Adams in that conversation with Emma mentioning, as you said, he doesn't want folks going down to Florida, even if those predictions might be a little overstated. Michael, you did a great photo essay showing all the interesting ways big spaces were repurposed for vaccination drives. Are there opportunities to rethink how we use Manhattan office spaces and workspace in general?
Yeah, I think there are. And, it's worth saying, by the way, that there were many people who felt that de Blasio was a little too developer friendly, too. So whether or not it is perceived that Eric Adams is more so for the benefit of the city or not, it remains to be seen, too. I think, what's an interesting phenomenon is the city is when we've had crises before, we have found ways to reinvent ourselves that have often been sometimes purposeful, sometimes accidental. After 9/11, you saw the way Lower Manhattan came back almost despite the fact that we built this office park at Ground Zero, became more mixed use. I think there's a good chance that we can reconsider a lot of these Class B offices, as they're called, not brand new, shiny towers, as residential. And I think there's an opportunity now to rethink neighborhoods of the city, including Midtown, that could become much more appealing and actually therefore more commercially appealing to a lot of companies as well. So yeah, I think this is an opportunity. Crises are, opportunities that shouldn't be given up to rethink at a real scale. And let me just say one other thing about that. One of the most interesting changes in the city and one of the greatest signs of hope was the fact that overnight 10,000 permits were granted to restaurants which were in such trouble, right? To open up these street side pavilions, and what that did was not just critical lifeline for the hospitality industry, but it also reinvigorated and reimagined our streets at scale and showed us that we can do these kinds of things in a big way if we just have the impetus and the political capital behind it. So, we'll see about office space and housing, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we can come out of this in a different but potentially stronger place.
That's encouraging. I'm sure every person who lives in New York lost some of their favorite restaurants and places to go during this time, but has also liked the expanding, outdoor areas and things like that. You want, that mix of both to be possible in our new city. Ginia, you pointed out the uneven reopening and economic recovery in the city, and your sense that well-to-do New York City is especially out of touch with the pandemic, the inequality that exists across the city. Subscribers Ellen from San Francisco and Janie from Brookline, Massachusetts, they want to talk more about the inequality and what, if anything, is being done to bridge that gap between the two New Yorks that we know exist.
Right. It's a great question because, de Blasio came in on the campaign platform of, mending the tale of two cities, and the pandemic really widened the gap and made those differences, put those differences really in high relief. And walking around different neighborhoods, walking around wealthy neighborhoods, Brownstone, Brooklyn, downtown Manhattan, Upper East Side, it's like nothing happened. There's this absolute sense of joy, especially when restaurants opened and outdoor dining and open streets and all that, and people having a great time. And then you go to the poor neighborhoods where there's been this, devastation at the street retail level. And also, I think one of the most striking symbols to me in the difference is walking around neighborhoods like Brownsville, everyone outside, and this is before the Delta. The Delta was originating. Everybody's wearing a mask, and they're wearing masks because people are scared and they're unvaccinated, and they have very reasonable, they have a reason to be fearful of the medical system because of the history of the medical community's treatment of minority populations. So you see everybody in one person having a wonderful time, and people, displaying genuine concern and fear. Now, the city, I think, is doing a good job, an okay job, getting those vaccination rates, ticking them up in poor neighborhoods, in low-income neighborhoods. I was just looking at statistics in Brownsville a few weeks ago. Full vaccination rate was only 33%. Now it's ticking to close to 40. So that is a good sign, because when people are vaccinated, they can obviously, go back to work, but work more freely, live more freely. And that's one, encouraging sign. Another thing is that workers are a little more empowered now, because many people left the city, especially in the service industries, and there's a labor shortage. And so they're empowered. They can ask for more. And that is a really positive thing, obviously.
We also have a question from Chai in Bushwick, Brooklyn, where I live. Shout out to Bushwick. Crime was clearly a major issue in the citywide elections. But what kinds of solutions are acceptable to New York City voters? Is it as simple as strengthening the NYPD? I'm going to kick it off here, and then I'll give Junior and Michael some time to think about this. I remember being with Eric Adams and asking him specifically about this question. And you get an interesting mixed answer from him. One, you have a candidate who is deeply focused on crime as a starting point, saying that public safety had to be taken care of before you can get to economic parts of the city. But you also had a candidate that was very explicit about the need for reform. And he has talked about diverting money that was typically used for the NYPD department and bringing in folks who have those more soft skills while focusing police skills on the hotspot areas of violent crime. We also should acknowledge that violent crime in New York City, particularly murders, have gone down in June and brought them back closer to numbers that we have seen in previous years. So a little bit of the fears of the big crime wave, particularly about murders and violent crime that we saw the last couple months, we should probably temper with this new evidence. I want to kick it off to Jinya here too. What do you think are going to be some of the solutions we may see going forward that are acceptable to New York City voters?
Right.
And is it a real tension between the city about whether to strengthen the NYPD or to shift it?
I think that people want, across the board, they want a compassionate police presence, an understanding police presence. They don't want, when you go into high crime neighborhoods, especially to speak to, older people, people want the police there. They want the police to be, treating them with respect and dignity. And one thing that is happening is in the new city budget, there is an allotment for mental health professionals to come at the scene, of domestic disputes, come at the scene of incidents where often the police are there and aren't really necessary. And that, I can't imagine anyone, on either side of the debate not thinking that was a truly positive development.
Mm-hmm. I thought about a moment that I want to bring here before kicking into Michael about our last question, is I remember Eric Adams asking me while we were eating where I lived. And when I told him the part of Bushwick in which I lived in, he said, people think this election is going to be, he said he remembers how no one used to live there out of fears of public safety and the rampant crime. And that people think the election will be decided by people who live there currently, when the election will really be decided by people who are fearful about what it used to be. And that really rang true in terms of the type of coalition he was able to build. But it does mean that there's going to be another part of the divides of the city that folks are going to have to come together for as we look forward. Michael, you get our last question. You've been looking at other cities across the pandemic. What has COVID taught us about city life or life in the US? This is from subscribers Amy in Wilsonville, Oregon, and Noah in New York.
Well, I think what this has taught us is that cities are incredibly vibrant, strong places where people wish to be, and that's partly about jobs, and but it's largely, I think, also about community. I mean, one of the most beautiful lessons, I think, of COVID in New York was that in the darkest times, you had people banging pots out windows. And then as soon as there was some sense that people could go outside, people gathered in the streets. The renovation of those streets with places to eat wasn't only about restaurants. It was also about reclaiming this kind of common shared space that is part of this, that is essentially our common ground, our sense of ourselves. And I think that it was a strengthening process to go through this together. I think for other cities, you've seen very similar kinds of evolutions, you might say, that the early days were partly filled with fear, that the city itself was the enemy, and then gradually an understanding that our shared mission of trying to make this work was a source of strength and a consolation. And I would also say that, I mentioned earlier, I think New York has gotten better after crises. We often do take time and often fail really to take advantage or to even recognize an opportunity. But then sometimes events like this can galvanize political will and popular sentiment. And my hope is that this will be that. We are a very divided city still, in a divided nation. But I think COVID in some ways brought us together.
One subscriber said, why do so many talk like New York City is falling to the ground? I do not understand the doom scenario that many are talking about. Virginia, what do you think about that? Is it doomsday, or are you optimistic?
I'm extremely optimistic. I mean, I understand that perspective, in May of 2020, but so much has happened. And one, of course, the American Rescue Act. I mean, it's going to, in the city, the expansion of the child tax credit is going to have a transformational impact on child poverty. So I don't see any reason to really think this is the end, or this is 1976 or 1992 or anything like that. I mean, and I think, as Michael said, crises make people really, really, really committed to the city. People who stayed are in it. They're all in it. They want to bring new merchants to their devastated retail corridors. They want to be more involved in local politics. I'm seeing that where I live in Brooklyn. So it's hard to find the seeds of pessimism.
Can I just add to that? I mean, there are a lot of people out there for political or other reasons, they have always wanted to declare the city over. And the city has been killed off repeatedly in reporting and over decades. Gene, you mentioned the 70s. You go back to the 60s and the 50s and the 90s and 9/11 and Harvey and the Great Recession. And I mean, this is just a kind of story that people tell themselves about the city for whatever reason. I don't think New Yorkers say it about ourselves if you really push us, because I think we have the experience and faith in the city that shows us that things, work themselves out. I think the impulse to do that, to declare the city dead or dying, is not just from the outside, but a fear that it's a really complicated thing it's kind of an amazement that it exists at all, and a complicated thing to run, and it's, that should be a source of inspiration as much as fear. I don't mean to sound Pollyanna-ish, but I don't see why this event, we've even been through a pandemic before 100 years ago, is the death knell for the city. I think the reverse. The city, in some ways, can come out of this stronger, more vibrant, and more resilient.
Yes.
Well, I am soaking in both of you all's optimism, and I'm going to hold it with me as we continue here. I want to thank you both so much, and I appreciate your time talking with me about the future of New York City and giving us some hope here that the city that we love can come back even stronger.
Thank you, Ested.
Thanks, Ested. Thanks,
Great
Gina.
to talk to you.
Thank you
Great
all.
to see you, Michael. Bye.
Good to see you.
Culture is part of the lifeblood of New York City, whether it is a thrilling nightclub, a provocative theater production, or something that gives you a little bit of both. Metro reporter and Times Magazine writer Jazmine Hughes spoke with Jeremy O. Harris and chef Marcus Samuelsson the other week about New York City's culture and where it goes at this time. Now, Harris is the creator of the Tony-nominated Slave Play, a fascinating watch, and the co-writer of the movie Zola, which I've already seen twice and had a blast both times. Samuelsson is the award-winning chef and owner of Red Rooster restaurant in Harlem, along with dozens of restaurants from London to Bermuda. He recently released a cookbook named The Rise, Black Cooks and the Soul of American Food. I also want to just say he is one of my favorite guests on Chopped, which to me is his most important qualification. They are both very important and iconic New York cultural figures, and we are excited to hear how they're processing this moment for the city. They started by describing what drives them to New York, what draws them here. Here's an excerpt of that conversation.
You both have lived in a variety of other cities. Jeremy, you lived in LA, you lived in Chicago. Marcus, I know you've lived a variety of other places too. How does New York stack up to other cities in your travels?
Well, I think, so much of our experience as Black people in several other cities, we kind of have to hide them in a different way or experience them in a different way. But because of Harlem and because of Brooklyn and because of the Bronx, places where hip hop was originated in, and other boroughs like Queens, where, street art and street life and so much of our culture was not hidden. Our culture was up front. For me as a Black chef, coming to Harlem, knowing that Maya Angelou worked there, knowing that James Baldwin, knowing that Jeremy's cousin, Langston Hughes, worked there, you know what I mean? Like that for me it shows me as a chef that I don't have to hide my craft. I don't have to disguise my craft. And that is so centered to who I am as a creative person that there are others that either see me or are of me, right? And as a Black creative, so often we come from these different places and there's definitely no one like us in these smaller places. Like I remember that growing up in Gothenburg, and that sort of really shapes your identity. Like, am I ever going to meet someone that is like me? And then you come to New York City, and you might not meet them in cooking, or you may, but you might meet them through Broadway, or you might meet them through artists, and we could trade notes. There is no other place where I knew that I could do that. For me, that was really, really important, because being Black, this idea of being Black and lowering my ambition, it's not how I was raised. New York City allows me to be Black and don't lower my ambition and don't be apologetic about it.
One of the things that I love about what you just said, Marcus, is that there are very few cities where there are not only ghosts, but there are monuments to those ghosts, right? Everywhere we go, there are these Black ghosts, these brown ghosts that sort of follow us and guide us, who we can see parts of it. But in New York, specifically, they're true monuments to like their lineage and what they gave us and the foundations upon which we stand, right? Knowing that I can go to Soho and see the first theater where Adrienne Kennedy had her first play. I can go to the Signature and witness where she like made sense of her voice in the 90s. It's something that I can't get anywhere else. You know, like I'm so excited and honored that I get to do this with you because I'm such a fan of, you know, people who can work in the art of cuisine. And I admire it so much because it's something that's so beyond me. And like one of the things that really started drawing my eyes to Black chefs specifically was finding out about Edna Lewis and all the things she did and the ways in which like this idea of farm to table that's like so a part of every restaurant I go to was introduced by this Black woman, right? There's a palpable sense that like when you go through New York City, you can see these landmarks, whether they've been named or not. I love that you just mentioned that.
And we just elected a new mayor of New York City, right? The second Black mayor in New York City's existence, and we saw several other Black candidates for mayor at the same time. How is the experience, or is the experience of Black people in New York City changing in any ways since you've gotten here, good or bad? Marcus, I'll start with you because you've been here quite longer.
Wow. Well, it definitely has improved. I came here in the middle of Giuliani's time, not having my papers in order, and eventually remember the day when I got them. And it was very much linked to, you know, I was here during Louima. I was here during a lot of different events where like the dialogue between New York City Police and the mayor, it was the Boys Club. And the city was definitely not thought about Black men as an asset. We come a long way with that. You know, one of the best things about living in Harlem for me is that I can really put check and balances to the racism that goes on that you might not see, but it's happening, right? And I'm going to give you two examples. The pandemic officially then starts in March, right? Between mid-March, Rikers Island populations being lowered. There's nothing wrong with that, but the majority, a lot of that population were dropped off in Harlem with a $20 or $40 bill, nor were they home in Harlem. They were just dropped off in buses. At the same time, homeless population was bussed into Harlem, still is every day, by the way, also on 125th and Lenox. These are just, try that stuff in Midtown, try that stuff in the West Village. It would take one day. And the chaos that has created, right? Everything from COVID test, mask, all of it. It's just a chaos, right? That the population of Harlem now has to just navigate through, whether you take your kids to school, whether you go and buy something in the store. So I look at growth and strength when I see that the Student Museum are building a new building, which is incredible. The fact that we can create more jobs with restaurants like Melba's and JJ's and Red Rooster. I see it. It's like, yes, this is happening. But at the same time, I also see how vastly our village, Harlem, got changed post-pandemic. And it's been very difficult.
Jeremy, I'd like to refine my question to you specifically and maybe talk about a little bit your experiences just walking the street as a queer person in New York compared to the other places where you've been.
I think that when one asked me, like, you know, are things different for Black people or, you know, anything, I was immediately thinking about my queerness and my community, which are primarily, you know, Black and brown, like women and like queer people, a lot of trans women. And I think a lot about the ways in which their bodies, I think in relationship to where I grew up, are definitely much safer here than in Martinsville, Virginia. But what I also noticed in Virginia recently when I went back to Danville was that now being exuberant, being visibly queer is seen as like a marker of some sort of class thing that I wasn't aware of, wherein people have this like excitement and they're like, wait, and like I swear to you, 4 different times I was asked, wait, are you a YouTuber? Are you a vlogger? In relationship to how I dress. And it was seen as like this great thing. Whereas in New York, I definitely feel as though there is a weird thing that's happening where people who feel displaced, generally like men of between the ages of like 23 and 30, I think articulating more like sort of like violence because they feel so like erased by the presence of queerness, which is something I have been seeing more often in New York recently, especially in relationship to my like quite visibly like early transition friends and to myself when I walk around in like a Tom Brown skirt, you know. I've gotten more calls and like jeers and like leers than I had in like the 5 years previous, when we were all in the trains together. But I think post pandemic, a lot of people being furloughed, a lot of people not having much, seeing people walk around seeming free, in some way, I think feels like an affront to like the position that we are all in.
It doesn't, for some reason, it truly doesn't surprise me that people would equate your visible queerness with like a higher income bracket, because for so many people, making that quote unquote chance or taking that quote unquote chance means that you have security blanket, right? That like your employment or your well-being is not contingent upon your presentation or your visibility.
Jeremy, it's fascinating that you talked about you tell this experience. I think is so powerful. Before I did the prep work about sort of opening Rooster, you know, Paris is Burning was probably like one of the biggest inspiration to me, where just like creating these magical balls, but it was not related to money. They didn't have a lot of money, but they also were protecting each other and created these communities for each other, and it was fabulous and it was great. And I just looked like that. I was like closing my eyes, like, okay, Gin is downstairs. It has to be like Paris is Burning. It has to be that tight community. It has to be that beautiful experiences that was not about money. It was just about us, whatever us was. And that was just beautiful. It was just, for me, it's one of the most beautiful movies. And also one of the reasons why you want to live in New York City. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah. I mean, that so I one of the like surprises of this year is that I guest edited the September issue of Interview Magazine, which is like, you know, sort of this
yeah. Like, not just drop it, like, actually that's a big deal.
It's a huge deal. I mean, you know, one of the things I write about a lot is that, like, I do feel like this summer, post-pandemic, we did start entering a New York that felt nostalgic, and new, like some, like, Phoenix Rising moment, that's very different than the post-9/11 New York that felt more, like, cloistered and less interested in new and different and more interested in, like, whiteness and, like, Americanness. And the post-pandemic New York, where a lot of people who had like, you know, family money and like, you know, had moved into the highest of highest class brackets, all abandoned their apartments in the city and moved upstate or moved somewhere else. And now the city was full of like the freaks and weirdos who wanted to like make New York their actual home, that place I imagined when I was like in Virginia. And because of that, New York feels horny again. It feels sexy again. It feels like sticky and weird. And I think that there is something happening now that's getting back to that, like, it doesn't matter how much it costs. I mean, it doesn't matter how much money you have. You look fab, come to this club, which we had lost in New York. And so I'm happy that you have a space like that in Harlem.
But even during the full pandemic, people always said, well, you know, everyone has left New York. And I was like, no, that's highly offensive to me. It's like, the people I know are in New York, they're working, and they are making sure that the city is amazing. And so it was just like this, like, null effect of like, no, everybody's gone. What do you mean everybody's gone? I mean, I just felt like it was such a arrogant way of dealing, because these are truly the heroes that stayed and made the city fabulous and incredible during the darkest and one of the toughest times of all time.
And it speaks a lot to what people are even seen as people, right? And what people are seen as like workers or support staff, or, you know. You both moved to New York with not a lot of money. So what has that real class jump been like? What has that change in your New York City experience been like, going from coming in with not a lot of money to being where you are now?
Honestly, I don't even buy into the question, because I've never seen myself as any class. Like, I'm here for the food. I'm going to cook the best food, and I'm going to create with other creative people. And sometimes that means I'm cooking in the park for free, and sometimes I mean I'm cooking for $1,000 plate. But part of being an artist is that you have to be arrogant enough to don't live the way people, I don't live in the mirror of an audience. I live for the craftsmanship of my craft. Of course, I remember a big moment was when I was able to buy an apartment. Yeah, that's a big step. But I never associated because it's never why I came to the city for. Like, I'm very clear on my craft. And if I would translate it into what I can buy for that, I don't think I would focus on my craft, and I can't do that.
You see, what's so funny is that I think that because so much of my craft is about dissecting the identities that I inherited and the identities that I'm constantly moving in and around, the fact of my class is something I'm very consciously aware of, right? Like, what class I was born into and what class I am rapidly drifting towards, or rocketing towards, partially because of my own will and also partially because of, factors much outside of it. And I think that, one of the things that's really wild about being in New York and processing those questions are the ways in which I know that when I was first coming to New York as a young person, visiting my best friend at grad school, I've not forgotten the sort of like deep embarrassment and shame I felt having to like jump a turnstile, right? Like going to the train and like feeling like, oh my God, like my whole life could like shift rapidly if the wrong person sees me doing this and tries to stop me and like doesn't like a gesture I make and then like pulls a gun. Like, this can be like a deep embarrassment on my mom who's like, I've given you all the things you need. Why did you like not have enough money to like get on the train? And I have to explain to her like, oh yeah, Mom, well, I decided that I wanted to go out to dinner with all these people last night, and I thought that if I went to the dinner that such and such was going to pay for it because he literally is a millionaire. But then the check came, and then he said like, oh, everyone put out your cards, and so the $150 you gave me, $130 to this dinner last night that I didn't know I was going to be paying for, I don't have that reality anymore, right? Like my reality is so wildly different. I don't take the train because I don't have to, right? Like I have the gift of time, like the privilege of time because I became one of those rare New York artists who not only did a play on Broadway, but also like was Anna Wintour's like, guest at dinner. And so I've met all these other people who were like, oh my God, Jeremy should totally write this movie for you. So now my name's being said in all these other rooms. And I think that one of the things that's so wild to me about the sort of class ascension that can happen in New York is that it does feel like Cinderella or something, right? And I keep wondering when midnight's gonna come. And yet, like, because of the proliferation of my name in all those spaces, it's allowed people to get to know my work that I think 5 years ago, 10 years ago, people would not have wanted to talk about it in the same way. I happened to have my play come out at the right time, in the right year in New York, when people wanted to start having different conversations about race. And it changed my life forever.
I just want to say that it's so funny because I take the train for inspiration, right? Like, I love taking the train. Like, I see New York. Maybe it's because I didn't grow up here. Maybe because I didn't grow up in America. I always feel like me taking the train is always where I learn cultures, subcultures. I see what people are wearing. I see some new snacks. And and I love this conversation because as three Black creatives, we have a lot of things that we share, but we also have three completely different experiences, this is the most important part, that we're not monolithic in our experiences. And I just think it's so beautiful. And this is the reason why I moved to New York City, to have a conversation like this.
Absolutely. Also, the reason I don't take the train is because I do have obsessive compulsive disorder. And so it was always a place of utter, like, true stress for me. Like, anxiety out the window every time I touch any odd liquid. I don't know if you guys saw this, but last year Vogue asked me to write with Bardia, who directed this like I Love New York video for Vogue. And one of the only lines that got cut was Whoopi Goldberg talking about going into the shit train on the subway, and that being a thing like, I both love and hate about New York. Because I feel like the first 3 years I was there, I was always so excited about seeing an empty train car that I was like, oh my God, finally no people around. I always end up on the poop train.
Jeremy, thank you. Thank you, Jazmine, for having me. Normally we go out and have dinner. I will cook for you guys, and I'm not going to stick you with a $130 bill. Jeremy, I promise you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for being here today with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you need to be reminded about what makes New York City great, I'm sure that conversation covered it. That was just a portion of an hour-long exchange between Marcus Samuelsson and Jeremy O'Harris and Our Times reporter Jazmine Hughes. We'll include other excerpts on this page tomorrow. There are a couple of things that stuck out to me. How Samuelsson described the freedom that New York City can give newcomers of all races who can find community and passion in many forms. I know I experienced that. Harris made the great point of our overlapping identities, that while we're all bound together by New York City, there's also a queer New York and a Black New York, a food New York and an old nostalgic New York. Those spaces overlap and intersect, which is what makes the city great, but they have all been upended by a pandemic that has challenged us in unique ways. Whatever your takeaway was, it will take the commitment of all of us for New York or wherever you live to be back in its full form. I know that we have lost friends and family members during the last year. We have missed birthdays and anniversaries. We've missed work friends and our frenemies. But hopefully we've gained something too, and that is an appreciation of the cities and where we live and the communities that banded together in times of need. That's it for our program. A recording of this full event will be on this page shortly. If you want to rewatch any of it, I want to thank everyone who joined me. And this event is a special part of our series just for subscribers, because if you want to make our work possible, and hopefully you do, from our reviews of the best of theater to our COVID tracking and to our politics reporting, we thank you for subscribing to the New York Times, and we thank you for your support. Have a great rest of your day.
Hi, I'm Nikita Stewart.
I'm Albert Sun.
Hi, I'm Emily Weinstein.
I'm Carlos Tejada.
Through my work, I explore the intersection of policy and race and inequality.
I help the Times track the vital data of the pandemic, recording the numbers of every case and death in each county across the U.S.
In my work, I want to use food to tell you stories about the world, and I also want to give you something delicious to cook for dinner.
I explore the rise of China, India, and the Asian region.
One thing I never lose sight of, no matter where my job takes me, is that it's readers like you that make it all possible.
So on behalf of myself and all of us at the Times, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being a subscriber
and supporting the work that we do every day.